The Starlight. Charity Gala wasn't just an event. It was a universe of power, wealth, and ambition condensed into a single, glittering ballroom. At its center was Arthur Parker, a man whose net worth could alter the fate of nations. But in the space of a single heartbeat, all that power meant nothing. As champagne flowed and billion-dollar deals were whispered, the unthinkable happened. A gasp rippled through the crowd as the titan of industry collapsed. Cameras flashed, security surged forward, but everyone was frozen. Everyone except for the one person nobody noticed, a waitress named Isabel. What she did next didn't just save a life, it shattered a dynasty and exposed a secret buried for 25 years. The air in the grand ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria was thick with the scent of money, an intoxicating perfume of rare orchids, expensive cologne, and the subtle metallic tang of ambition. Chandeliers dripping with thousands of crystals cast a fractured, dreamlike glow on the assembled pantheon of New York's elite. This was the annual Starlight Charity Gala, an evening where the city's most powerful people gathered to publicly display their generosity, while privately cementing the deals that kept their empires turning. At the gravitational center of this universe was Arthur Parker. At 65, he had the sharp, predatory profile of an eagle with eyes the color of a winter sky that missed nothing. His company, Parker Innovations, was a behemoth, its tentacles wrapped around everything from global logistics to cutting-edge biotech. He moved through the crowd with an economy of motion that bespoke absolute confidence. A nod here, a firm handshake there, each gesture was a transaction, a reaffirmation of his place at the apex of the food chain. Yet behind the formidable facade, a deep weariness had settled into his bones. The smiles he received were reflections of his balance sheet. The laughter was tuned to the pitch of his stock price. It was a gilded hodge, and he was its most prized and most isolated occupant. His gaze drifted past the fawning socialites and landed on his corporate nemesis, Donovan Reed. Reed was 30 years his junior, a Silicon Valley upstart who'd made his fortune in disruptive tech and carried himself with the smug swagger of a man who believed he was inventing the future. "Arthur, you old dinosaur." Reed said, his voice a smooth, condescending purr as he intercepted him near the silent auction. "Good to see they still let you out past sundown. I was just admiring the bid Parker Innovations put on the children's hospital wing. A bit conservative, don't you think?" Arthur's smile was thin and cold. "Generosity isn't a competition, Donovan. It's a responsibility. A concept your generation seems to have replaced with brand synergy." The veiled insult hit its mark. Reed's smile tightened. "Times change, Arthur. Adapt or become a fossil. My company just secured the patent on the neural interface tech your R&D department has been chasing for 5 years. The future doesn't wait for responsibility." The barb was sharper than Arthur had expected, a direct hit to his professional pride. A familiar, tight sensation bloomed in his chest, a dull ache he'd grown accustomed to ignoring. He'd been warned by his private physician, Dr. Matthews, about stress. "Your heart is a precision machine, Arthur," the doctor had said, "but it's been running at maximum output for 40 years. Even legends need to rest." Rest was a luxury he couldn't afford. He turned away from Reed, needing a moment to compose himself. The tightness was spreading, a cold pressure radiating down his left arm. He dismissed it as indigestion, a consequence of foregoing lunch for a brutal quarterly review. Meanwhile, weaving through the labyrinth of tables with a tray of champagne flutes was Isabel Rossi. To the guests, she was invisible, a functional part of the scenery in her crisp black and white uniform. But to Izzy, this room was a world away from her reality. At 26, her life was a cramped apartment in Queens, a mountain of debt, and the ever-present cloying smell of antiseptic from the hospice where her mother, Sophia, was slowly fading. Izzy was supposed to be in her 3rd year of medical school. She had been at the top of her class, a natural with a gift for diagnosis and a calming bedside manner. But then her mother's multiple sclerosis had taken a devastating turn. A promising experimental treatment, one she had poured all her hopes and savings into, had backfired horribly, accelerating the disease's progression. School became an impossible luxury. Waitressing at high-end events like this paid the bills barely. Her mind was a split screen, one half focused on the immediate task, keep the glasses full, avoid collisions, remain unnoticed. The other half was a running commentary of medical observation. She saw the forced smiles and noted the dilated pupils of a guest who'd had too much to drink. She clocked the slight tremor in an elderly woman's hand, a possible sign of early-onset Parkinson's. She saw the flushed face and sheen of sweat on Donovan Reed, likely from a combination of arrogance and alcohol. And then she saw Arthur Parker. He was standing alone, his back to the crowd, one hand gripping the velvet rope of a stanchion. She noticed his pallor first. Under the warm ballroom lights, his skin was ashen, almost grey. She saw the subtle tension in his jaw, the way his knuckles were white where he gripped the rope. While everyone else saw a titan in a moment of repose, Izzy saw a textbook collection of symptoms. Diaphoresis, a possible grimace of pain masked as a frown. The way he was subtly leaning his weight onto the post, her training buried but not forgotten, screamed at her. Acute myocardial infarction, angina pectoris. She hesitated. What could she do? She was a cater waitress. Approaching a man like Arthur Parker would get her fired instantly. Her manager, a stern woman named Francine, had been clear. You are ghosts. You see nothing. You hear nothing, you say nothing. You just serve. But the image of her mother, frail and helpless in her hospice bed, flashed in her mind. She had been helpless to stop the disease that ravaged her. She couldn't stand by and be helpless again. Taking a deep, steadying breath, she placed her tray on a nearby serving stand and began to move toward him, a small, determined figure cutting a path through a sea of oblivious power. Every instinct, every fiber of her being told her that something was about to go terribly, horribly wrong. The world for Arthur Parker was narrowing to a pinpoint. The vibrant cacophony of the gala, the music, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, faded into a dull, distant roar, like the sound of the ocean heard through a seashell. The tightness in his chest was no longer a dull ache. It was a crushing weight, an invisible vice, squeezing the life from him. His meticulously tailored tuxedo suddenly felt like a straitjacket. The pain wasn't just in his chest anymore. It was a searing fire shooting down his arm and into his jaw. He tried to take a breath, but his lungs wouldn't cooperate. Black spots danced in his vision, eclipsing the glittering chandeliers. He saw Donovan Reed across the room laughing, and the sight filled him with a sudden, impotent rage. He would not die here. Not in front of him. Not in front of any of them. He tried to push himself upright to regain control, but his body betrayed him. His legs gave way, and the velvet rope slipped from his grasp. The sound that followed was not the dignified thud of a man fainting. It was a sickening final crash. Arthur Parker, the unbreakable titan, hit the polished marble floor with the full weight of his unconscious body. A nearby table was jostled, and a crystal flute of champagne shattered the sound, cutting through the din like a gunshot. For a full 3 seconds, the room was suspended in disbelief. Then chaos erupted. A collective gup swept through the ballroom. People surged forward, a morbidly curious wave of silk and diamonds. Phones were instantly raised, their screens glowing like malevolent eyes, capturing the downfall of a king. "Someone do something," a woman shrieked. "Call 911, another voice yelled, though no one seemed to be moving to do so. Donovan Reed stood frozen, his smug expression replaced by a mask of pale shock. Security guards, large men, trained to handle external threats, pushed through the crowd, but they were utterly unprepared for a medical emergency of this magnitude. They formed a protective but useless circle around their fallen client. "Give him some air." "Is he breathing?" The questions were frantic, useless. The circle of onlookers was a wall of panic and morbid fascination. But Isabel Rossi wasn't watching. She was moving. The moment Arthur collapsed, her hesitation evaporated, replaced by a cold, clear focus. The ballroom, the guests, her job, it all vanished. There was only the man on the floor and the ticking clock. "Out of my way! Please let me through," she yelled, her voice cutting through the panic with an authority that surprised even herself. The crowd, startled by this uniformed girl who dared to command them, parted instinctively. She dropped to her knees beside Arthur, the expensive fabric of her uniform scraping against the hard marble. The years of studying, the late nights poring over medical textbooks, the hours in simulation labs, it all came rushing back. Her fingers went straight to his carotid artery. She held her breath, counting. 1, 2, 3. Nothing. No pulse. Her eyes flickered to his chest. It wasn't moving. Cardiac arrest. He's not breathing. "His heart has stopped," she announced, her voice steady and loud. "I need an AED. Does this venue have an automated external defibrillator?" She looked up at the stunned security guards. It's a red or white box on the wall. It should be marked, "Find it now." One of the guards, a burly man named Dave, snapped out of his stupor and began barking into his radio. The other looked at Izzy, bewildered. "Who are you? That doesn't matter right now." She shot back, her hands already moving to Arthur's chest. She ripped open his starched white shirt buttons, flying across the floor. She interlocked her fingers, placed the heel of her hand on his sternum, and began compressions. 1 and 2. And 3 and 4. She counted aloud, her voice, a metronome, in the chaotic silence that had fallen over the room. The rhythm was perfect, the depth exact. It was brutal physical work. Her arms, conditioned by carrying heavy trays, were strong, but the force required was immense. She could feel the faint, sickening give of his ribs, a necessary evil she'd been trained for. The crowd watched in stunned fascination. This waitress, this nobody, was pounding on the chest of one of the most powerful men in the world, her face a mask of intense concentration, her brow beaded with sweat. Donovan Reed looked on his face a mixture of horror and something else, a flicker of professional calculation. An event like this, it would tank Parker's stock price. Here. The guard. Dave skidded to a halt beside her, thrusting the red AED box into her hands. Izzy didn't miss a beat. She tore open the box, pulling out the pads. Her movements were swift and efficient. She followed the diagram, placing one pad on his upper right chest and the other on his lower left side. "Everyone stand back," she commanded. The machine's automated voice began to speak cold and robotic. Analyzing heart rhythm. Do not touch the patient. The seconds stretched into an eternity. The entire ballroom held its breath. Izzy's gaze was locked on Arthur's still face. For a fleeting moment, she saw not a billionaire, but a fragile human being, his life hanging by the thinnest of threads. She saw the lines of stress etched around his eyes, the vulnerability he kept so carefully hidden from the world. Shock advised. Charging. Stand clear. A high-pitched whine filled the air. Clear! Izzy yelled, her hands hovering inches above his body. The machine delivered the shock. Arthur's body arched violently off the floor, a single spastic convulsion before falling limp again. Izzy's fingers were immediately back on his neck. Still nothing. No pulse. Resuming compressions, she stated, her voice tight with strain. She began the rhythmic pumping again, her own heart hammering against her ribs, her muscles screaming in protest. The world had shrunk to this single desperate task. The man on the floor, the cold marble beneath her knees, the frantic beat she was trying to force back into his silent heart. She would not let him die. Just as she was about to begin another cycle, she heard the wail of sirens growing louder outside. The paramedics were coming, but she knew that for Arthur Parker, these minutes, the ones she was fighting for, were the only ones that mattered. The arrival of the paramedics was a blur of professional efficiency. They swarmed the scene, their movements sharp, and practiced a stark contrast to the gawking paralysis of the gala's attendees. Izzy, exhausted and trembling with adrenaline, relinquished her position, giving a concise clinical report. Male mid-60s. Witnessed collapse. No pulse, no respiration upon initial assessment. One shock delivered by AED, no change. Approximately 6 minutes of continuous CPR. The lead paramedic, a woman with tired eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, gave Izzy a quick, appreciative nod. Good work. You may have just saved his life. As they loaded Arthur onto a gurney, his face now covered with an oxygen mask, the bubble of clinical focus that had protected Izzy finally burst. The noise of the ballroom rushed back in the frantic murmuring, the insistent clicking of phone cameras. She was suddenly aware of her disheveled appearance, her hair stuck to her sweaty forehead, her uniform stained, and a small smear of Arthur's blood on her cheek from a button that had scratched him. Her manager, Francine, descended upon her like a hawk. "What do you think you were doing?" she hissed, her face pinched with fury. "You assaulted a guest. You ruined a $10,000 tuxedo. You are fired, Rossi. Get your things and get out." "I was saving his life," Izzy said, her voice barely a whisper. The injustice of the words, a fresh wave of shock. Before she could argue further, she was engulfed by a swarm of reporters who had bypassed security in the chaos. Microphones were shoved in her face. "What's your name? Did you know Mr. Parker? Are you a nurse?" The questions were a dizzying assault. Panicked Izzy pushed through the throng, muttering, "I have to go," and fled through a service corridor, her heart pounding a painful rhythm against her ribs. She didn't stop until she was outside in the cool night air, the wail of the ambulance fading in the distance. Fired. She had been fired for saving a man's life. The absurdity of it was almost laughable. The next 24 hours were a surreal nightmare. Her face was everywhere. Grainy cell phone videos of her performing CPR were on every news channel, every social media feed. She was dubbed the Angel of the Gala. The media, unable to find her, camped outside her small Queen's apartment building, turning her life into a spectacle. She stayed inside, blinds drawn, her phone turned off, feeling like a fugitive. On the second day, there was a sharp, persistent knock on her door. Peeking through the peephole, she saw a man in an impeccably tailored conservative suit. He looked more like a funeral director than a reporter. Cautiously, she opened the door a crack. "Miss Isabel Rossi?" he asked. His voice was calm and measured. "My name is Benjamin Carter. I am Mr. Parker's personal attorney and friend. May I have a moment of your time?" Reluctantly, she let him in. Her tiny apartment with its second-hand furniture and stacks of medical textbooks felt claustrophobic in the presence of his expensive, quiet authority. "Mr. Parker is alive?" "Miss Rossi." Benjamin began his expression grave. "He is in intensive care at Lenox Hill Hospital, but the doctors are unequivocal. Had it not been for your immediate and expert intervention, he would not have survived. The brain damage would have been irreversible within 4 to 5 minutes. You gave him that time." A wave of relief so profound it made her dizzy washed over Izzy. I'm so glad to hear that. Arthur Mr. Parker has no living immediate family, and he is not a man who accepts debts lightly. He has instructed me from his hospital bed to express his gratitude. He has authorized me to offer you a token of his appreciation." Benjamin slid a sleek leather folder onto her coffee table. Izzy stared at it, her heart sinking. She knew what this was. Hush money, a reward to make the story go away, to neatly tie up the loose ends of his public near-death experience. He is prepared to pay off your student loans in their entirety. Benjamin continued, his voice neutral. "And he has established a trust fund in your name. The initial principal is $2 million. Izzy stared at the man, speechless. $2 million. The number was abstract, meaningless. It was a sum that could solve every problem in her life. It could pay for her mother's hospice care 10 times over. It could put her back in medical school without a single worry. It could give her a life she couldn't even imagine. But as she looked at the folder, a cold, sickening feeling began to curdle in her stomach. It was the name of Arthur's company that triggered it. Parker Innovations. For the past year, she had obsessed over every scrap of information about the experimental drug trial her mother had participated in. It was a last-ditch effort, a new biologic agent designed to halt the progression of MS. But for a small, tragic subset of patients, including her mother, it had caused a catastrophic autoimmune response. She knew the name of the small, agile biotech firm that had developed it, Billionaire Labs, and she knew from a footnote in a devastating financial report she had read late one night that Billionaire Labs had been quietly acquired 2 years ago, bought out and absorbed its research and liabilities, now belonging to a much larger entity. She looked Benjamin Carter straight in the eye, her voice trembling slightly. Parker Innovations. She said the name tasting like ash in her mouth. Did they acquire a company called Billionaire Labs about 2 years ago? Benjamin's professional mask flickered. A hint of surprise or perhaps recognition crossed his features. He was a lawyer. He knew how to conceal his thoughts, but for a fraction of a second he was transparent. Yes, he admitted, his voice cautious. It was a minor acquisition part of our biotech portfolio expansion. Izzy felt the floor drop out from beneath her. The man she had saved. The man now offering her a fortune, a new life. He was the owner of the company, the very entity whose failed drug had destroyed what was left of her mother's health. The money on the table wasn't a reward. It was blood money. A cosmic, cruel joke delivered in a leather folder. She pushed the folder back across the table. "No," she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of grief and rage. "I can't accept this." Benjamin Carter stared at her, genuinely perplexed for the first time. He had expected tears of gratitude, ecstatic acceptance. He had not expected this. "Miss Rosie, I don't think you understand." "Oh, I understand perfectly," she interrupted, standing up, her small frame radiating a sudden, fierce energy. "You can tell Mr. Parker that his money is not wanted here. You tell him I don't take payment from the man who ruined my mother's life." The sterile scent of the hospice was the smell of Izzy's life. It clung to her clothes, her hair, her memory. After a sleepless night, wrestling with the revelation about Parker Innovations, she found herself by her mother's bedside, the multi-million-dollar offer, feeling like a phantom limb, an extension of her life that was both there and not there, and a source of constant aching pain. Sophia Rossi was a shadow of the vibrant woman who had raised Izzy alone, a woman who loved to dance and filled their tiny apartment with the aroma of garlic and basil. Now she was frail, her body curled under the thin white blanket, her breathing a shallow rhythmic whisper. The MS had stolen her mobility years ago, but the failed drug trial from Waitress Labs had stolen her mind, leaving her adrift in a fog of confusion with only fleeting moments of lucidity. Izzy held her mother's cool, papery hand. "Hi, Mama," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "It's me. It's Izzy." Sophia's eyes, a pale, cloudy blue, flickered open. For a moment, there was a spark of recognition, a faint smile gracing her lips. "My Isabella, my little doctor." The words were a knife in Izzy's heart. Not yet Mama, but soon. It was a lie she told herself as much as her mother. "There was a man," Sophia murmured, her voice distant, her thoughts drifting like sap. "He smelled of the sea and leather. A long time ago." Izzy squeezed her hand, trying to ground her. This was a new fragment of memory, something she'd never mentioned before. But just as quickly as it appeared, the moment of clarity was gone. Sophia's eyes unfocused, and she slipped back into the quiet, inaccessible world she now inhabited. Izzy sat there for hours, the conflict raging within her. The $2 million. It was an obscene amount of money, but it was also the key. It meant the best care for her mother. A private room, round-the-clock specialists who might be able to offer some comfort, some small improvement. It meant a future for herself, a return to the path she had been forced to abandon. She could become a doctor and dedicate her life to preventing what happened to her mother from happening to anyone else. But at what cost? Accepting the money felt like a betrayal. It felt like absolving Arthur Parker of his company's sin, like putting a price tag on her mother's suffering. It was a devil's bargain, and either choice led to a different kind of damnation. Meanwhile, across town, in a sterile white hospital room, the gears of the Parker empire were grinding. Arthur was awake, tethered to a web of monitors and IV drips. His near-death experience had stripped him of his usual armor, leaving him looking older, more vulnerable. Beside his bed stood not a concerned relative, but his sharp-witted nephew, Carter Parker. Carter was the vice president of Parker Innovations, a position he'd earned more through bloodline than merit. He had his uncle's ambition, but none of his vision or grit. He saw Arthur's sudden mortality not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. The board is concerned." Uncle Arthur Carter said, his voice laced with a synthetic sympathy. The stock took a 17% hit after the news broke. The investors are spooked. They see weakness. Arthur's gaze was cold. The stock will recover. It always does. Worry about the Q4 projections, not the gossip. It's more than gossip. Carter pressed a little too eagerly. This waitress, this Isabel Rossi, the media is painting her as a working-class saint, and you as... Well, the story needs to be managed. Benjamin told me you offered her a ridiculous sum of money, and she refused. Arthur's silence was his confirmation. See, it makes you look weak, guilty even. Carter continued. We need to control this narrative. My PR team has a plan. We bring her in, give her a token position in the company's charitable foundation, parade her around at a press conference. We turn her into a Parker Innovation success story. Your hero now a part of the family. It's perfect. Arthur's eyes narrowed. She is not a PR problem to be managed, Carter. She's the woman who saved my life. You will leave her alone. The command was absolute, but Carter was already calculating. His uncle was weak, sentimental. If he couldn't control the waitress, perhaps he could discredit her. Dig up some dirt, leak a story that she was an opportunist. He would not let some no-name girl from Queens interfere with his ascent to the throne. The pressure on Izzy was mounting from another direction, too. A sleek black car had been parked outside her building for a day. Finally, the passenger emerged Donovan Reed. He caught her as she was leaving to pick up groceries, his smile as polished and predatory as ever. Isabel Rossi, he said, extending a hand. Donovan Reed. I was there, at the gala. What you did was truly remarkable. Izzy eyed him with suspicion. Thank you. Look, I'll be direct, Reed said, getting straight to the point. I know who Arthur Parker is. He'll try to buy your silence, bury you in gratitude so he can control the story. I have a different offer. My company, Reed Dynamics, is launching a new medical technology initiative. We're looking for a public face for our outreach program. Someone with real-world experience, someone authentic, someone like you. We'd match Parker's offer, put you through medical school, and give you a platform to actually make a difference. Izzy stared at him. It was the same offer wrapped in a different package. She was no longer a person. She was a commodity, a symbol to be bought and sold by powerful men. First Parker, then Carter's Machiavellian PR schemes, and now Reed's transparent attempt to use her as a weapon against his rival. She was trapped a pawn in a game played by kings. The weight of her mother's illness, the crushing burden of her principles, and the relentless pressure from a world that had suddenly discovered her were becoming unbearable. Standing on a cracked sidewalk in Queens, she felt the walls closing in. She had to do something. She couldn't run, and she wouldn't be bought. There was only one path left. She had to face the man at the center of the storm. The VIP wing of Lenox Hill Hospital was another world. It was hushed and carpeted with soft lighting and tastefully abstract art on the walls. It felt more like a luxury hotel than a place of healing. For Izzy, dressed in simple jeans and a worn sweater, it felt like crossing into enemy territory. She had refused Benjamin Carter's calls, ignored Donovan Reed's messages, and dodged the press. She had come here on her own terms. She gave her name at the nurse's station, and the reaction was immediate. A senior nurse with a practiced, calm demeanor appeared. Miss Rossi, Parker has given instructions. Please come with me. Arthur Parker's room was a corner suite, with a panoramic view of the city he had conquered. But the man in the bed looked anything but triumphant. The web of wires was still there, the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor, a constant reminder of his fragility. He was sitting up a tray of untouched food beside him. When he saw Izzy, his pale blue eyes, so formidable at the gala, held a different expression, weary, guarded, and surprisingly curious. "Miss Rosie," he said, his voice raspy but firm. "Thank you for coming. Please sit." Izzy remained standing near the door. "I'm not here to thank you, Mr. Parker, and I'm not here for your money." Arthur inclined his head slightly. "Benjamin informed me. He also informed me of the reason you gave. Billionaire Labs." He said the name without flinching, but Izzy saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a deep, ancient pain. "My mother was in their trial for a drug called NV34. Izzy said, her voice low and steady, fueled by a righteous anger she had been suppressing for a year. She was one of the success stories at first, and then the side effects began. It didn't just fail to help her, it attacked her system. It accelerated her decline. The doctors called it a catastrophic cascade. Your company bought them. You bought their research, their patents, and their failures. So when you offer me $2 million, it feels like you're trying to put a price on what your company took from her. From me." Arthur listened to every word, his expression unreadable. The beeping of the monitor remained steady, a counterpoint to the emotional storm in the room. When she finished, a long silence stretched between them. "I was not aware of the specifics of the NV34 trial," he said finally, his voice heavy. "The acquisition was one of dozens, a line item on a spreadsheet vetted by my people. That is not an excuse. It is a failing on my part. The responsibility is mine." The simple direct admission caught Izzy off guard. She had expected denials, legal jargon, a deflection of blame. She had not expected accountability. The night of the gala. Arthur continued, his gaze drifting toward the window. "As I was falling, the last thing I thought was, what was it all for? All the deals, the rivals, the numbers going up. I have built an empire of things. Miss Rossi and I was about to die utterly alone in a room full of people." He looked back at her, his eyes holding hers. "You didn't just save my life. You gave me a question I can't answer. And then you walk in here, a ghost from a past I didn't even know I had, and refuse my money for a reason of principle. I find I am in desperate need of understanding people like you." Before Izzy could respond, the door opened and Benjamin Carter entered, holding a thin file. He stopped short, seeing Izzy, but Arthur waved him in. "Benjamin, good, you have it, Arthur." "Perhaps this can wait," the lawyer said, glancing nervously at Izzy. "No, it can't," Arthur insisted. He gestured to the file. "When I learned who you were, Miss Rossi, I asked Benjamin to look into the Waitress acquisition more deeply, and to look into you, not to find leverage, but to understand." Benjamin reluctantly opened the file and handed a single sheet of paper to Arthur. It was a copy of Izzy's birth certificate. Arthur stared at it, his breathing becoming shallow. The heart monitor began to beep a little faster. "Mother's name," he read aloud, his voice cracking. "Sophia Rossi." He looked up at Izzy, his face a canvas of disbelief and dawning horror. "Your mother is Sophia Rossi?" "Yes," Izzy said, confused by his reaction. "How do you—" Arthur's hand trembled as he reached into the drawer of his bedside table. He fumbled for a moment before pulling out a worn leather wallet. From a hidden compartment, he extracted a small, faded photograph, its corners softened with age. He held it out to her. Izzy took it hesitantly. The photograph was of a young man and a young woman standing on a sun-drenched pier. The man was unmistakably a young Arthur Parker. His hair darker, his face unlined, a genuine, unguarded smile on his lips. The woman beside him, her head resting on his shoulder, was radiant. She had a cascade of dark curls and a laugh that seemed to echo from the old photograph itself. Izzy's breath hitched in her throat. She knew that face as well as her own. It was her mother, Sophia. The room fell silent save for the frantic, accelerating beep of the heart monitor. Izzy looked from the photograph of the happy young woman to the broken old man in the bed, and then she thought of the mother she had just left in the hospice, lost in a fog of memory. The pieces of a puzzle she never knew existed began to slam into place with a devastating, impossible force. The story her mother sometimes whispered about a man who smelled of the sea. The fact that she never ever spoke of Izzy's father. Arthur Parker, the billionaire, whose life she had saved, the corporate titan, whose company had destroyed her mother's health, was looking at her as if he were seeing a ghost. "Sophia," he whispered, his voice choked with a grief that was 26 years old. "I looked for her. For years. She just disappeared." He looked at Izzy, his eyes wide with a question he was too terrified to ask. "Your father. She never told you about him." "She never told me anything," Izzy whispered back, her world tilting on its axis. "I don't have a father." The beeping of the monitor became a shrill, steady alarm as Arthur Parker, for the second time in a week, stared into the face of a truth his heart could barely withstand. He was looking at his daughter. The shrill alarm of the heart monitor jolted the room into action. A nurse rushed in, her face a mask of concern. "Mr. Parker, your heart rate is dangerously high." "Sir, you need to calm down." "I'm fine," Arthur rasped, waving her away. His eyes never leaving Izzy's face. "Leave us." The nurse hesitated, glancing at the frantic numbers on the screen, but the raw authority in his voice was undeniable. She backed out, closing the door softly. The silence that returned was heavier, more profound than before. It was filled with the weight of unspoken history, of a life that had been fractured and a connection that had been denied. Izzy sank into the chair she had previously refused, the faded photograph still clutched in her trembling hand. The smiling woman on the pier and the frail, lost woman in the hospice were two halves of a life torn apart. And this man, this powerful, broken stranger, was the missing link. "Tell me," Izzy said, her voice barely audible. "Tell me everything." And so the story came pouring out of Arthur Parker, a confession that had been dammed up for more than a quarter of a century. He spoke of a summer in Montauk, long before he was a titan of industry. He was just Arthur, then a young man with ambition, but also with a heart that was still his own. He was working a summer job on the docks, trying to escape the suffocating expectations of his own domineering father, a ruthless patriarch who had built the first iteration of the Parker fortune. Sophia Rossi was a local artist working as a waitress to make ends meet. She was full of life fire and a joyful spirit that was the antithesis of his cold, calculated world. They fell in love hard and fast, in a whirlwind of bonfires on the beach and stolen moments on the pier. He told her about his dreams. She showed him how to see the color and beauty in the world. For 3 months, he was truly happy. "I was going to leave it all behind for her," Arthur said, his voice thick with regret. "The company, my inheritance, my father's approval. I was going to ask her to marry me. But his father, William Parker, found out. He saw Sophia as a threat, a commoner who would dilute the family's power and distract his heir. He confronted Arthur, giving him an ultimatum: end it with the girl, or be cut off, completely disowned, and left with nothing. Arthur, young and foolishly believing he could reason with his father, refused. That was when William Parker played his cruelest card. He intercepted a letter Arthur had written to Sophia, and he forged a reply. A brutal, cold letter supposedly from Sophia, saying she had met someone else, that their summer romance was just that, a fling. It said she wanted nothing more to do with him. Crushed and humiliated, believing the woman he loved had betrayed him. Arthur returned to New York, threw himself into the family business, and walled off his heart forever. He became the ruthless man the world knew, a man built on the foundation of a single devastating lie. "I never stopped looking for her," he whispered, tears tracing pathways through the lines on his face. "I hired private investigators years later after my father died. But she had vanished. It was as if Sophia Rossi never existed. Now he knew why. She had been hiding, protecting her child from the family that had so cruelly cast her aside. The pieces clicked together for Izzy. Her mother's deep-seated sadness, her fierce independence, her refusal to ever speak of the past. It wasn't bitterness, it was a shield. And Billionaire Labs. Izzy asked the final, painful piece of the puzzle. Arthur's face contorted in a fresh wave of agony. "After my father's death, I learned the full extent of his manipulations in business, the lives he'd ruined. I created a silent investment arm, a way to fund projects I thought could do some good, to atone for his sins. I was drawn to Billionaire because their lead researcher was working on a cure for a rare neurological condition, the same one my mother, William's wife, had suffered from. I funded them to try and cure the disease that took my own mother, never knowing, never imagining that their work would one day be used on Sophia. The irony was staggering, a tragedy of Greek proportions. In trying to atone for the sins of his father, he had inadvertently visited a new one upon the only woman he had ever loved. He wasn't a monster. He was a man trapped in a story written by a ghost. Their shared moment of raw, painful discovery was interrupted by the hushed vibration of Benjamin Carter's phone. He glanced at the screen, his face darkening. "Arthur, I apologize for the interruption, but you need to see this." The lawyer said, his voice grim. He handed the phone to Arthur. It was an article from a notorious financial gossip blog published just minutes ago. The headline screamed, "Parker's heir, apparent Carter. Parker in secret talks with Reed. Dynamics for hostile takeover. Sources claim Arthur Parker's health is gravely compromised." The article detailed how Arthur's nephew Carter, believing his uncle to be incapacitated and his reputation damaged, had made a secret pact with Donovan Reed. They planned to leak damaging information about Parker Innovations, including a heavily spun version of the failed Waitress drug trial, to drive the stock price into the ground. Then, with backing from Reed, Carter would lead a shareholder revolt and seize control of the company, carving it up between them. The betrayal was swift and absolute. While Arthur was fighting for his life and confronting the ghosts of his past, the jackals were circling, ready to tear his life's work to shreds. His own blood, his nephew was leading the charge. Arthur looked from the phone to Izzy. He saw not just the daughter he never knew, but the only person in the world he could now trust. The weariness in his eyes was replaced by a familiar cold fire. They had tried to bury him. They had mistaken his moment of vulnerability for weakness. They had no idea who they were dealing with. And they had no idea that the Parker dynasty, which they thought was ending, had just found its true heir. The news of Carter Parker's treachery acted like a powerful stimulant. The frail, reflective man in the hospital bed vanished, and in his place was the formidable strategist who had built an empire. The battle for his company was a language Arthur understood perfectly, and he would not lose. Not now. Not when he had just found something worth fighting for, beyond balance sheets and stock prices. Benjamin Arthur set his voice resonating with its old command. "Call an emergency board meeting. Remote access. I'll attend from here. And get me our head of communications, Jennifer. Now." Over the next few hours, Izzy watched in awe as her father, a man she had just met, dismantled his enemies with surgical precision. He worked the phone like a conductor, his weak voice growing stronger with every decisive command. He leveraged his relationships with loyal board members, preempted Carter's moves, and strategized with his legal team. He was a general marshalling his forces for war. But his masterstroke was not a financial one. It was a human one. "Jennifer," he said to his communications chief over the speakerphone, "cancel the press release about my health. We're holding a full press conference tomorrow morning, and I won't be the only one speaking." He looked directly at Izzy. "Dad? Arthur? I don't know what to call you, Izzy," began, her head spinning. "I can't. I'm not a part of your world. You are the only part of my world that matters anymore," he said, his voice softening. "Carter and Reed are trying to use your mother's tragedy as a weapon against me. They want to paint Parker Innovations as a villain. The only way to fight a lie is with the truth. Our truth." The press conference was a media circus. It was held in the hospital's auditorium, packed with reporters and television crews, all expecting to hear a story of corporate backstabbing and a CEO's failing health. They got something entirely different. Arthur Parker appeared via a live video feed from his hospital room. He looked tired, but resolute. He began by acknowledging the hostile takeover attempt, confirming the rumors of his nephew's betrayal. He laid out with brutal clarity how he had already checkmated their moves, securing the board's loyalty and protecting the company's assets. Donovan Reed and Carter Parker were finished before they had even begun. Then the story shifted. But this attack on my company was predicated on a lie, Arthur announced, his voice echoing through the stunned auditorium. A lie concerning a company called Waitress Labs and the tragic failure of one of its clinical trials. To tell the truth about that, I need to introduce you to someone. The camera feed switched to a second screen. On it was Isabel Rossi, seated not in the auditorium, but in a quiet, comfortable room. Beside her, propped up on pillows and looking more lucid than she had in months. Thanks to a new team of specialists Arthur had flown in overnight, was her mother, Sophia. Izzy, her voice clear and steady, told her story. Not as a victim, but as a daughter. She spoke of her mother's illness, her own abandoned dream of being a doctor, and the devastating impact of the failed drug trial. The reporters listened captivated. This was the human cost Carter and Reed had planned to exploit. Then Arthur came back on screen. What the men who tried to destroy my company didn't know, he said, his voice thick with emotion, is that the woman whose suffering they sought to use for their own gain Sophia Rossi is the great love of my life. And the brave young woman who saved my life at the gala, the woman they tried to buy and manipulate, Isabel Rossi, is my daughter. A tidal wave of shock rolled through the room. The story was no longer about a corporate takeover. It was a saga of lost love, a secret child, and a stunning reunion. Arthur went on to announce the creation of the Sophia Rossi Foundation, endowed with a colossal $5 billion from his personal fortune. Its mission was twofold: to provide the best possible care for all patients negatively affected by the Waitress trial, and to fund transparent, ethical, and groundbreaking research into neurological disorders. And he announced its future head. "The foundation will be led," he declared, looking straight into the camera, by its new chief medical advisor upon her graduation from Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, which she will be attending on a full scholarship. My daughter, Dr. Isabel Rossi Parker. In the aftermath, the Parker empire was not just saved, it was reborn. Carter was exiled from the company and the family, a pariah in the world he so desperately wanted to conquer. Donovan Reed's reputation was shattered, his predatory tactics exposed to the world. Izzy's life transformed, but not into the empty existence of a socialite she might have feared. Her days became a blend of the old and the new. She spent precious, lucid hours with her mother, whose condition was now managed by the world's best doctors, bringing a measure of peace and comfort to her final chapter. She also spent time with her father, the two of them tentatively, awkwardly, building a bridge across 26 years of silence. They were stranger with a shared history, finding their way back to each other, one conversation at a time. True to his word, Arthur funded her return to medical school. She wasn't just a student anymore. She was a woman with a mission. The apathetic, invisible waitress was gone, replaced by a future leader in medicine driven by a deep personal purpose. She would wield the power and resources of the Parker name, not for profit or prestige, but to heal, to fix what was broken, and to ensure no one else suffered the way her mother had. Her brave move at the gala hadn't just saved one man's life. It had redeemed his soul, righted a historic wrong, and set her on a path to save thousands more. The collapse of the Billionaire was not an end, but a beginning for them both. And so a single moment of chaos in a glittering ballroom became a story of redemption, reunion, and rebirth. Isabel Rossi. The invisible waitress proved that true power isn't measured in dollars, but in courage and compassion. Arthur Parker, the lonely king in his corporate castle, found that the greatest treasure he ever possessed was the daughter he never knew he had. Their story reminds us that beneath the surface of our ordinary lives, extraordinary connections are waiting to be found, and that a single act of bravery can change everything. It shows that even the most broken families can find a way to heal, and that our greatest tragedies can sometimes lead us to our true purpose. If this story of courage and destiny moved you, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs a reminder that heroes are all around us. Don't forget to subscribe and click the notification bell so you won't miss our next incredible real-life story. What did you find most shocking about this story? Let us know in the comments below. On a brutal New York City night, two separate worlds were set on a collision course. One belonged to a reclusive billionaire, the king of a global fashion empire, who found himself freezing and abandoned with nothing. The other belonged to a young waitress buried in debt, whose only possession of any real value was the warm coat on her back. She offered him that coat, her only protection against the storm, expecting nothing in return. She had no way of knowing she had just saved one of the world's most powerful men, or that this simple gesture of humanity would plunge her into his world of unimaginable luxury, dangerous secrets, and life-altering opportunity. This is the remarkable account of how a single thread of kindness wove an entirely new destiny. The wind that howled down the Bowery that January night was a physical entity, a predator with teeth of ice. It found every crack in the old brickwork of the daily grind, the 24-hour diner where Clara Hayes spent most of her waking hours. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and frying onions, a scent that clung to her clothes and hair long after her shifts ended. At 24, Clara felt closer to 50, her dreams of attending the Fashion Institute of Technology. Fight had evaporated 2 years ago, consumed by the towering inferno of her mother's medical bills. After her mother passed, the debt remained a cold, heavy ghost tethered to her name. Now her life was a repeating cycle of taking orders, wiping down sticky tables, and counting the meager tips that were never quite enough. Her one treasure, the one thing that connected her to her past and her dormant dreams, was the jacket she wore. It was a vintage wool peacoat, a deep charcoal grey that had been her mother's. It was worn, the lining patched in 3 places, but the cut was timeless. Clara, with her innate eye for design, had subtly altered it, reinforcing the seams with a distinctive cross-stitch pattern on the cuffs using a dark crimson thread. It was her signature on a masterpiece nobody else would ever recognize. That jacket was her armor against the cold, but more than that, it was her last tangible piece of her mother's embrace. Just after 2 a.m., when the diner was populated only by the city's ghosts, a lone cabbie nursing a coffee, a couple of students cramming under the flickering fluorescent lights, the door swung open with a violent gust of wind. A man stumbled in, and he didn't look like he belonged. He wasn't one of the usual lost souls. He was clean, but utterly ravaged. He wore a tailored black tuxedo, now soaked and disheveled, the kind of suit you'd see at a gala at the Met, not in a grimy diner at this hour. But he had no overcoat, no scarf, no gloves. His face, sharp and handsome, with high cheekbones and intense grey eyes, was pale with a bluish tint around his lips. His dark hair was matted with what looked like melting sleet. He was shivering uncontrollably, his whole body racked with violent tremors. He collapsed into the booth nearest the door, fumbling with his hands as if he'd lost all dexterity. Clara's boss, a perpetually sour man named Mr. Henderson, glanced up from his racing form. "Hey, pal, you gonna order or just drip all over my floor?" The man didn't seem to hear. He was trying to speak, but his teeth chattered too hard. Clara felt a pang of something sharp and urgent. It wasn't pity. It was a profound, almost painful empathy. She saw past the expensive ruined suit to the raw human suffering beneath. She ignored Mr. Henderson's glare, poured a mug of hot water from the coffee machine, and added a slice of lemon and a spoonful of honey. She brought it to the man's booth. "Here," she said softly, her voice steady. "Drink this. It'll help." He looked up at her, and his eyes, though clouded with cold and confusion, held a flicker of surprise. He reached for the mug, but his hands were shaking too violently. Clara instinctively placed her own hands over his, steadying the mug as he brought it to his lips. The warmth was immediate and stark. "Thank you." He managed to rasp his voice, a dry whisper. "You need to get out of those wet clothes," she said, her concern overriding her usual quiet demeanor. "Do you have a phone?" "Someone you can call." He shook his head, a gesture of profound weariness. Lost it. Everything. Mr. Henderson lumbered over. All right, that's enough. The charity hour is over. Buy something or get out. I'm not running a shelter. He's freezing, Mr. Henderson, Clara pleaded. Just let him warm up for a few minutes. A few minutes is up. Out. He pointed a greasy thumb toward the door. The man tried to stand, but a wave of dizziness sent him slumping back into the booth. Clara saw it then, the desperate vulnerability. This wasn't a choice for him. The city would swallow him whole tonight. In that moment, Clara made a decision that made no logical sense. It defied her poverty, her own need, her own shivering walk home that awaited her. She shrugged off her mother's peacoat. The sudden cold of the diner air hit her thin sweater, but she ignored it. She draped the heavy wool coat over the man's trembling shoulders. It was far too small for his broad frame, but it was warm and dry. He looked at her, his expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. I can't, he stammered. You have to, she insisted, pulling the lapels closer around his neck. He could feel the residual warmth of her body in the fabric. Just for tonight. Get somewhere safe. She reached into her own pocket and pulled out a crumpled $10 bill, her taxi fare home. She'd have to walk the 30 blocks now. She tucked it into the pocket of the tuxedo jacket. For a cab. He just stared at her, his grey eyes searching her face as if trying to memorize it. He seemed to be fighting to say something important, but the cold had robbed him of his words. He fumbled inside his own jacket, his fingers stiff and clumsy. He pulled out a small rectangular card and pressed it into her hand. Find me, he whispered, his voice cracking. Before she could respond, he gathered a sliver of strength, pulled her coat tight around himself, and stumbled back out into the raging storm, disappearing into the swirling snow. Clara was left standing in the middle of the diner, shivering in her thin sweater, with a soggy embossed business card in her hand. You're a fool, Hayes, Mr. Henderson grunted, shaking his head as he returned to the counter. A complete fool. That coat was the only decent thing you owned. Clara looked down at the card. The ink was slightly smeared. It read, Silas Sterling, Creative Director. Sterling Atelier. She'd never heard of it. It was probably some small, insignificant design shop. She sighed, the weight of her decision settling upon her. She had just given away the last piece of her mother to a stranger for a meaningless piece of cardstock. A cold deeper than the winter wind began to seep into her bones. The 30-block walk home was a special kind of torment. The icy wind sliced through Clara's thin sweater, and by the time she reached her tiny fifth-floor walk-up in the Lower East Side, her own teeth were chattering as violently as the stranger's had been. She spent the night huddled under every blanket. She owned the ghost of her mother's coat, a tangible absence. Mr. Henderson was right. She was a fool. The next morning, nursing a head cold and a deep sense of regret, she looked again at the business card. Sterling Atelier. Out of a bleak curiosity, she typed the name into the cracked screen of her old smartphone. Her breath caught in her throat. The search results exploded with images of supermodels on runways in Paris and Milan, articles from Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, and the Wall Street Journal. Sterling Atelier wasn't a small shop. It was a global luxury fashion house, a titan of haute couture, famous for its revolutionary designs and astronomical prices. A single sterling handbag cost more than she made in a year. And Silas Sterling. He was no mere creative director. He was a myth, a legend, a design prodigy who had inherited the company at 25 and transformed it into an empire. He was also notoriously reclusive, a genius who rarely appeared in public, his face known only from a few grainy photographs. He was the invisible king of a world she could only dream of. Clara stared at the card. It had to be a fake. A cruel joke. The man in the diner was probably a delusional partygoer who'd stolen a wallet. The real Silas Sterling wouldn't be freezing to death on the Bowery. Shaking her head, she tossed the card into a small wooden box where she kept Button's loose threads and other mementos. Another broken piece of a broken dream. Meanwhile, across town, in a sprawling penthouse overlooking Central Park, the real Silas Sterling was battling a severe case of pneumonia. The night had been a blur of cold pain and disorientation. He'd made it back on foot, stumbling through his own lobby like a vagrant, before his security team had recognized him and sounded the alarm. His ordeal hadn't been an accident. It was a meticulously planned coup. His ambitious sister Beatrice, the COO of Sterling Atelier, had arranged it. During a tense family dinner to discuss the company's future, she had drugged his wine. Her men had then driven him out to a deserted industrial park in Queens, stealing his phone wallet and overcoat, and leaving him to freeze. Their goal to have him declared missing and incapacitated so she could seize control at a critical board meeting scheduled for the next day. But they hadn't counted on his sheer will to survive, or on Clara Hayes. For 2 days, Silas drifted in and out of a feverish state, attended by a private doctor. His first coherent words were not about his sister or the business. They were the jacket, the waitress, his fiercely loyal executive assistant, Isabelle Laurent, a woman in her 40s with a razor-sharp mind and an impeccable sense of style, was by his side. "Sir, I was in a diner," Silas rasped, his voice hoarse. "On the Bowery, I think. A young woman. She gave me her coat, a grey peacoat. There was stitching on the cuff. Crimson." He remembered the feel of the warm wool, the scent of lavender, and something uniquely hers that clung to the fabric. He remembered the quiet dignity in her eyes, the kindness that had radiated from her like a palpable force. She hadn't asked for anything. She had simply given. In a world of transactional relationships, her selfless act was an anomaly, a beacon. "I need you to find her, Isabel," he commanded, his voice gaining a sliver of its usual authority. "I don't care what it takes. Find that diner. Find that woman." "Of course, Mr. Sterling," Isabel said already, tapping notes into her tablet. "Do you have a name? A description?" Clara Silas whispered the name, surfacing from the fog of his memory. He wasn't sure if he'd heard it or imagined it. Or maybe he couldn't remember. Young. Brown hair, kind eyes. That's all I have. And the coat. The coat is the key. The mission was next to impossible. The Bowery and its surrounding neighborhoods were home to dozens, if not hundreds, of diners, cafes, and greasy spoons. For the next week, Isabelle Laurent, a woman more accustomed to negotiating with Parisian textile magnates and scheduling private jets, found herself in the gritty underbelly of New York. She moved with quiet efficiency, showing a photo of a similar peacoat to gruff owners and world-weary waitstaff. She was met with shrugs, suspicion, and outright hostility. No one knew anything. no one cared. Back at the atelier, Beatrice was seething. Silas had recovered enough to join the board meeting via video call from his bed, his face pale but his mind sharp. Her coup had failed spectacularly. Now he was back in control, and she was under a cloud of suspicion she couldn't dispel. When she heard about his obsessive search for some anonymous waitress, she was filled with contempt. "He's lost his mind," she vented to her confidant, fixated on some charity case while the spring collection hangs in the balance. "This is a weakness, a sentimentality we can use." She instructed her own people to subtly interfere with Isabel's search. A few diner owners were quietly paid to forget seeing anyone matching the description. To Beatrice, this waitress was a loose thread that needed to be snipped before she could be woven into the family tapestry. A week turned into 2. Clara's life continued its downward spiral. Her cold worsened, her tips dwindled, and an eviction notice was taped to her apartment door. The memory of the stranger was a sore spot, a reminder of her own foolish, impulsive nature. She had given away her warmth and her history, and for what? An empty gesture. The world, it seemed, did not reward such things. She was starting to believe Mr. Henderson was right about everything. The heating system at the daily grind chose the coldest day in February to finally give up the ghost. A frigid draft now supplemented the icy glares of Mr. Henderson. The waitstaff wore extra layers, their breath misting in the air as they delivered plates of lukewarm eggs. For Clara, who now only had a thin hoodie to wear under a cheap wind-permeable jacket, each shift was an exercise in endurance. She was clearing away plates from a corner booth when the bell above the door chimed. A woman entered who was so out of place she might as well have landed from another planet. She was tall and elegant, wrapped in a tailored Christian Dior coat, the color of cream. Her leather gloves were buttery soft, and her sharp, intelligent eyes swept across the dingy diner, missing nothing. This was Isabelle Laurent. After 2 weeks of dead ends and false leads, her methodical search had finally led her here. She had cross-referenced every 24-hour establishment with staff rotas she'd discreetly acquired, looking for female employees working the graveyard shift on the night of the storm. Henderson immediately approached her, his usual scowl replaced with a fawning, greasy smile. "Welcome, ma'am. Table for 1. Isabel's gaze was cool. "I'm looking for one of your employees. A young woman likely worked the late shift about 2 weeks ago, on the night of the blizzard." Henderson's eyes flickered with a flicker of recognition, and then cunning. Beatrice's associate had paid him a visit and $100 last week to forget that night. "Don't recall anyone special. We get a lot of people through here." But Isabel's attention had been caught by someone else. An elderly woman with kind, wrinkled eyes, sitting at the counter, a regular named Mrs. Gable. She had seen the whole exchange that night, and had been touched by Clara's kindness. Mrs. Gable gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod towards the back of the diner, where Clara was scraping plates into a bin. Isabel's eyes followed the gesture and landed on Clara. She saw the worn-out sneakers, the cheap hoodie, the tired look on her face. It didn't fit the profile of a gold digger or an opportunist. It fit the profile of exactly the kind of person Silas had described. Ignoring Henderson, Isabel walked directly towards Clara. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm and professional. "My name is Isabelle Laurent. I'm looking for the woman who gave her coat to a man during the storm 2 weeks ago." Clara froze, a half-eaten piece of toast stuck to a plate in her hand. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs. She immediately thought she was in trouble. Had the man been a criminal? Was this his angry wife or girlfriend demanding the jacket back? "I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, her default defense mechanism of deflecting and disappearing kicking in. "Please," Isabel said, her voice softening slightly. She could see the fear in the young woman's eyes. "You are not in any trouble. Quite the opposite. The man you helped is my employer. He was very ill. You saved his life." The words hung in the air. Saved his life? It sounded so dramatic, so unreal. Mr. Henderson bustled over. "Hey, leave my staff alone. She's working." Isabel fixed him with a look that could have frozen magma. "I suggest you return to whatever it is you do. This is a private matter." She then turned back to Clara. "My employer, Mr. Silas Sterling, would like to thank you personally. He also wants to return your property." Clara's mind was reeling. Silas Sterling. The name from the card. It was real. The man from the storm, the freezing stranger in the ruined tuxedo, was the reclusive billionaire designer. It was impossible. I have to get back to work," Clara said weakly, overwhelmed. "Of course," Isabel said, undeterred. She pulled a crisp, heavy stock envelope from her Hermès clutch. On the front, in elegant calligraphy, was the name Miss Clara Hayes. Isabel had done her homework. "Mr. Sterling has requested your presence at the atelier tomorrow at noon for a private appointment. A car will be waiting for you at your address at 11:30. Please accept his gratitude." She placed the envelope on a nearby clean table and gave Clara a small, reassuring smile before turning and gliding out of the diner, leaving a stunned silence and the faint, expensive scent of Chanel No. 5 in her wake. The entire diner had been watching. Clara's co-worker, Veronica, a woman with a perpetually sneering expression, let out a derisive snort. A private appointment. With Silas Sterling. "Yeah, right. He's probably suing you for assault with a deadly jacket." Mr. Henderson snatched the envelope from the table. "What is this nonsense?" He felt the weight of the card stock, saw the embossed crest of the Sterling brand. His face paled slightly. Clara, moving as if in a dream, took the invitation from his slackened grip. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside the heavy card simply read, "Ms. Hayes, your kindness was a light in the dark. Please allow me to return it. A car will await you. Sincerely, Silas Sterling." It was a summons to another universe. A universe of wealth and power she couldn't comprehend. And as she stood there, shivering in the freezing diner, holding an invitation to the heart of a fashion empire, she felt a terrifying mix of hope and dread. Hope that her life was about to change, and dread that it would be in a way she was completely unprepared for. The morning of the appointment, Clara stood in front of the cracked mirror in her small apartment, a frantic mess of anxiety. What does one wear to meet a billionaire? Her wardrobe consisted of worn jeans, faded t-shirts, and her diner uniform. The irony was crushing. She was being summoned to one of the world's most prestigious fashion houses, and she had absolutely nothing to wear. She finally settled on her only good outfit, a simple black dress she'd bought from a thrift store years ago, paired with a mended cardigan. It was clean and neat, but under the harsh light of her bathroom, she felt like an imposter, a child playing dress-up. She nearly called the number on the card to cancel a dozen times, convinced it was all a mistake, a prank, or worse, a trap. At precisely 11:30 a.m., she looked out her window and saw it. A sleek black Mercedes-Benz S-Class, silent and imposing, parked at the curb of her graffiti-lined street. It was as out of place as a spaceship. The driver, a man in a crisp black suit, stepped out and stood by the rear door, waiting. This was real. The ride downtown was a silent, surreal journey through a city she suddenly didn't recognize. The familiar gritty streets of her neighborhood gave way to the gleaming canyons of Midtown Manhattan. When the car pulled up in front of the Sterling Atelier flagship store on Fifth Avenue, Clara felt a fresh wave of nausea. The building was a monument of glass and white marble, an imposing temple of fashion. The windows displayed not clothes but art installations involving single perfect shoes or impossibly draped silks. Through the glass doors, she could see a cavernous minimalist interior where impossibly chic salespeople drifted like specters among discerning, wealthy clients. Taking a deep breath, she walked towards the entrance. A formidable security guard in a tailored suit stopped her before she could even touch the door. "Can I help you, miss?" His tone was polite, but dismissive. His eyes flicking over her thrift store dress with clear disdain. I have an appointment," Clara stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "With Mr. Sterling." The guard's expression didn't change, but a flicker of disbelief crossed his eyes. "Name Clara Hayes." He spoke quietly into his wrist communicator. A moment later, his posture shifted. "My apologies, Miss Hayes. Please come in. Ms. Laurent is waiting for you." He held the heavy glass door open for her. As she stepped inside, a wave of warm, subtly perfumed air washed over her. The silence was absolute, broken only by the soft click of her worn-out flats on the polished marble floor. Everyone seemed to be looking at her, their gazes a mixture of curiosity and judgment. Just as the panic began to set in, Isabelle Laurent appeared, her expression warm and professional. "Ms. Hayes." "Welcome. I'm so glad you could make it." She guided Clara past the intimidating showroom towards a private elevator. "Mr. Sterling is waiting for you in his private studio." The elevator ascended silently, opening into a space that took Clara's breath away. It was a vast, light-filled studio with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Central Park. One wall was covered in corkboard, pinned with sketches, fabric swatches, and inspirational photographs. Another held shelves of art and design books. In the center of the room, standing by a large drafting table, was him. He was no longer the freezing, disheveled man from the diner. He was tall and commanding, dressed in a simple but exquisitely tailored black cashmere sweater and grey trousers. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and his grey eyes, now clear and piercingly intelligent, met hers across the room. He looked every bit the legend, the titan of industry. Yet, as he looked at her, his expression was not one of power, but of profound, quiet gratitude. "Ms. Hayes." "Silas Sterling," said his voice, a low, resonant baritone. "Thank you for coming." He walked towards her, and for a moment Clara was frozen, unsure whether to curtsy, shake his hand, or run. He stopped a respectful distance away. "I believe this belongs to you," he said. He turned to a nearby mannequin which was draped in a garment bag. With a theatrical slowness, he unzipped the bag. Inside, hanging perfectly, was her mother's charcoal grey peacoat. But it was different. It had been professionally cleaned. The wool was soft and restored, every loose thread mended. It looked not just new, but revered, preserved. The subtle crimson cross-stitching she had done on the cuff stood out, a tiny personal detail in this world of perfection. Thank you, she breathed, overwhelmed with emotion, as she reached out to touch the familiar fabric. No, Ms. Hayes. Thank you, Silas said, his voice laced with an intensity that startled her. I don't wish to be dramatic, but the doctors were quite clear. Another hour out there. Well, you didn't just give me a jacket. You gave me a great deal more than that. He then gestured for her to sit in one of the plush white armchairs. As Isabel served them tea in delicate porcelain cups, Silas recounted a carefully edited version of that night's events. He spoke of a serious business disagreement and of being dangerously stranded. He didn't mention his sister's betrayal, but Clara could sense the dark undercurrents beneath his calm words. He spoke of his desperation, the bone-deep cold, and the sudden unexpected warmth of her selfless act. As he spoke, his gaze kept drifting to the peacoat on the mannequin. There's something I have to ask you, he said, leaning forward slightly. He pointed to the cuff. This stitching. It's not original to the coat's design. It's a reinforcing stitch, but the pattern is unique. Did you do this? Clara blushed, feeling exposed. Yes. The seam was coming loose. It's remarkably precise. Silas mused, his eyes narrowing in professional assessment. The tension is perfect, and the choice of a contrasting crimson thread. It's not just a repair. It's a design choice, an embellishment. It gives the garment character. Where did you learn to sew like that? My mother taught me, Clara said softly. I wanted to. I was studying fashion design at FIT, but I had to drop out. A look of understanding dawned on Silas's face. It all clicked into place. The innate kindness, the appreciation for a well-made garment, the hidden talent in a single frayed cuff. He saw not just a waitress who had saved him, but a kindred spirit, a designer whose dreams had been derailed. And in that moment, his plan for how to thank her crystallized into something far grander and far more dangerous than simply returning a coat. A simple thank you is insufficient for what you did, Clara Silas said, using her first name for the first time. It sounded strange and formal in his resonant voice. Words are cheap. Sterling Atelier deals in tangibles. He stood and walked towards a set of tall, unmarked white doors at the far end of the studio. I had hoped to repay your warmth in kind. With a soft click, he opened the doors, revealing a walk-in closet the size of Clara's entire apartment. But it wasn't a closet. It was a private boutique. Racks upon racks of clothes were arranged by color and style. There were Sterling Atelier cashmere coats, Chanel tweed jackets, tailored trousers, and silk blouses. Shelves displayed a breathtaking collection of shoes, Louboutins, Manolo Blahniks, and handbags from Hermès and Fendi. A jewelry tray glittered with delicate gold necklaces and diamond earrings. Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. It was a fantasy made real, a treasure trove of impossible beauty. I took the liberty of having Isabel ascertain your measurements, Silas explained, his tone matter-of-fact. Everything here is for you. A new wardrobe. Consider it a token of my profound appreciation. Clara stared at the sea of luxury. A part of her was dizzy with excitement, but a larger, more insistent part felt a deep unease. This was too much. This was the kind of grand gesture a billionaire makes to erase a debt, to turn a human connection into a transaction. It felt like charity, a golden kit being built around the memory of a simple, honest moment. Mr. Sterling, "Silas, I can't accept this," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's too much, my jacket. It was just a coat. This is a fortune." Silas watched her, his expression unreadable. He had half expected this. He had seen the pride in her eyes at the diner. "You feel this cheapens your act of kindness," he stated. It wasn't a question. Clara nodded, relieved that he understood. "Yes, I didn't do it for a reward." "I know that," he said softly. "That is precisely why you deserve it." However he paused, closing the doors to the magnificent wardrobe, I sense that this is not the repayment you truly want. He walked back to the drafting table and picked up a charcoal pencil, turning it over in his fingers. "When I looked at the stitching on your coat, I didn't just see a repair. I saw talent. I saw potential that has been sidelined by circumstance. Am I wrong? I don't design anymore." Clara said the words, tasting like ash in her mouth. That Silas replied is a statement I refuse to accept. He looked her directly in the eye, his gaze intense and serious. "The clothes in that room are just things, Clara. They are beautiful, but they are hollow. The true gift I want to offer you is not a wardrobe, but an opportunity. Sterling Atelier runs a highly competitive paid internship program. The applicants are the best of the best from every top design school in the world. It is a brutal, demanding, and career-making experience." He set the pencil down. "I am offering you a place in the upcoming program. You would be paid a generous salary enough to clear your debts and live comfortably. You would have access to our resources, our craftsmen, our archives. You would learn from the best in the business. It will not be easy. You will be judged on your merit and your merit alone. My recommendation will get you in the door, but it will be your talent that keeps you there." Clara's world tilted on its axis. This was the dream she had been forced to bury, the future she had mourned. He wasn't offering her a handout. He was offering her a chance to earn back the life she had lost. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. Tears welled in her eyes, tears of shock and overwhelming gratitude. "Yes," she whispered the word, catching in her throat. "Yes. Absolutely, yes." A rare, small smile touched Silas's lips. "Good. Isabel will handle the paperwork. You start on Monday." He then gestured back to the wardrobe. "And please take the clothes. You can't very well show up to intern at Sterling Atelier in a thrift store dress. Consider it your new uniform." This time the wardrobe felt different. It wasn't charity anymore. It was an investment, an armor for the battles to come. News of the new intern spread through the atelier like wildfire. No one knew the full story, only that a former waitress with no degree had been personally hired by Silas Sterling. The rumors were vicious and immediate. She was his secret lover. She was blackmailing him. She was a charity project he would soon grow tired of. Beatrice Sterling heard the news with icy fury. She had her sources investigate Clara Hayes and the story they pieced together, a chance meeting in a diner. A given coat was both absurd and deeply threatening. She didn't see a good Samaritan. She saw a calculating nobody who had somehow sunk her claws into her brother's sentimental heart. Silas was brilliant, but he had this one blind spot, a weakness for a sob story. This girl, Beatrice, decided was a vulnerability, a threat to her own position, which was already precarious after her failed coup. Clara Hayes represented an unknown variable, an emotional attachment that could give Silas a strength Beatrice couldn't predict or control. "So my brother has a new pet project," she said to her assistant, her voice dripping with venom. "Well, pets can be trained, and they can be put down." Beatrice began to formulate a new plan. A plan not to oust Silas, but to isolate him. And the first step was to destroy his newfound prodigy. She would make Clara's life inside the atelier a living hell, ensuring she failed so spectacularly that Silas would be forced to cast her out, severing the bond between them and proving his emotional judgment to be flawed. The internship wouldn't be a dream come true. It would be a trial by fire, and Beatrice Sterling would be fanning the flames. Clara's first day at Sterling Atelier felt like being dropped into the middle of the ocean. Dressed in a pair of impeccably tailored Sterling trousers and a silk blouse from her new wardrobe, she looked the part, but she felt like a complete fraud. The other 5 interns were a clique of impossibly poised and confident graduates from Central St. Martin's, Parsons, and the Royal College of Art. They spoke in a shorthand of fashion theory and obscure European designers, their gazes sliding over Clara with a mixture of pity and contempt. They nicknamed her the Waitress. Her first few weeks were a blur of overwhelming tasks. She was relegated to grunt work, cataloguing fabric archives in a dusty basement, running errands for senior designers, and making endless cups of coffee. She did it all without complaint, her work ethic from the diner serving her well. She was observant, soaking up every detail, every conversation, every sketch she could glimpse. Slowly she began to learn, and Silas remained a distant though watchful presence. He offered no special treatment, adhering to his promise that she would succeed or fail on her own merit. His mentorship came in the form of brief, incisive critiques of her work during group reviews. "Your concept is strong, but your execution is timid," he would say, or "You're relying on aesthetics, not story." His words were tough but fair, and they pushed her harder than any textbook ever could. The first major project for the interns was to design a single evening gown for a hypothetical Met Gala theme, urban mythology. This was Clara's chance to prove herself. Drawing on her own life, she envisioned a gown that represented the resilience of the city. She designed a dress with a structured armor-like bodice made of recycled treated materials, which flowed into a skirt of soft, ethereal grey silk, like smoke rising from concrete. The design was deeply personal, reflecting her own journey from grit to grace. She worked tirelessly, staying late every night, her hands once accustomed to holding coffee pots, now deftly handling pins and shears. Her sketches were beautiful, and her concept was strong. For the first time, a few of the senior staff began to look at her with a flicker of respect. This was precisely what Beatrice had been waiting for. The first act of sabotage was subtle. The specific bolts of grey silk organza that Clara had sourced from a rare supplier in Italy went missing from the fabric room just days before her prototype was due. The inventory system showed they had never arrived. Clara panicked. There was no time to reorder. She was forced to use a lesser quality, slightly different colored silk that didn't drape the same way, compromising the central vision of her design. Next, the digital pattern file for her complex bodice, which she had spent a week perfecting, became corrupted. The IT department claimed it was a random server glitch, but the timing was too perfect. She had to pull 2 all-nighters, redrawing the entire pattern by hand, a painstaking process that left her exhausted and on edge. Through it all, Beatrice watched from the sidelines, her expression one of cool sympathy. Such a shame, she'd said to Clara in the hallway, her voice like honeyed poison. The industry can be so unforgiving. Perhaps you're just not cut out for this level of pressure. The final blow came during the intern presentations. As Clara presented her gown flawed but still beautiful, A testament to her resilience, Beatrice interrupted. "An interesting concept, Miss Hayes." She began, a predatory smile on her face. "So interesting, in fact, that it seems the house of Valerius in Paris agrees with you." On a large screen, she projected an image. It was a sketch of a gown remarkably similar to Clara's, bearing the signature of Jean-Pierre Valerius Sterling's fiercest rival. The sketch had been leaked to a prominent fashion blogger that very morning. The implication was clear and devastating: Clara the outsider. The charity case was a corporate spy. She had stolen a Sterling design and leaked it. The room fell into a shocked silence. The other interns stared at her with open hostility. The senior designers looked betrayed. Clara stood frozen in horror, the blood draining from her face. "No," she whispered. "I didn't. I would never." Silas's face was like stone. The company's policy on corporate espionage was absolute immediate termination and legal action. His expression was one of deep, profound disappointment. "Clara," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "My office. Now." In his studio, the silence was heavy and suffocating. Clara's mind was racing, trying to make sense of the nightmare. It was a setup, a frame job so perfect she had no way to defend herself. "I didn't do it." "Silas," she said, her voice shaking but firm. She looked him in the eye, her own gaze desperate but clear. "I don't know how that happened, but it wasn't me. You have to believe me." Silas stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. He saw the genuine terror and confusion in her eyes. He also saw the same unwavering integrity he'd seen in the diner that night. It didn't align with the actions of a spy. Then he thought about the recent series of unfortunate events: the missing fabric, the corrupted file. Random accidents, or a pattern? His gaze sharpened, not with anger at Clara, but with a cold, dawning suspicion directed elsewhere. "This meeting is over," he said cryptically. He turned to his intercom. "Isabel, cancel my afternoon, and get our head of security in here. I want a full forensic audit of the IT servers and a review of all security footage from the fabric room for the last 2 weeks." He turned back to Clara. "Go home, Clara. Don't talk to anyone. I will handle this." His tone wasn't warm, but it wasn't condemning either. It was the tone of a man on the hunt. The investigation was swift and ruthless. Isabel Laurel, using her formidable network, discovered that the fashion blogger who broke the leak had received a large anonymous payment from an offshore account. The IT audit revealed that the file corruption on Clara's design originated not from a random glitch, but from a specific terminal, the one in Beatrice Sterling's office. The final piece of evidence was the security footage. It showed Beatrice's personal assistant entering the fabric room late one night and leaving with the exact bolts of silk Clara had ordered. The pieces snapped together into a portrait of cold, calculated betrayal. It wasn't just about sabotaging an intern. It was about manipulating Silas, about proving his judgment was compromised by emotion. That evening, Silas called a private meeting in the main boardroom. It was just him, Beatrice, and Isabel, who stood silently in the corner, holding a tablet. "The intern situation has been resolved." Silas began, his voice dangerously calm. Beatrice smiled thinly. "I assume you've terminated her contract. It's for the best. A hard lesson, but a necessary one." "Oh, a lesson has certainly been learned," Silas said, his grey eyes turning to ice. He nodded to Isabel. Isabel tapped the tablet, and the security footage of Beatrice's assistant taking the silk played on the large screen on the wall. She then brought up the financial records, tracing the payment to the blogger, and the IT report pinpointing the source of the file corruption. Beatrice's face went white. The mask of serene control shattered, revealing the raw, venomous ambition beneath. "It's fabricated," she hissed. "She's turned you against your own family. That little tramp from the gutter." "Enough!" Silas's voice cut through the air like a blade. "You didn't do this to her, Beatrice. You did this to me. You used a good, innocent person as a pawn in your pathetic, endless game for control. You tried to poison my judgment to make me doubt my own instincts. You tried to turn an act of kindness that saved my life into a weapon against me." He stood up, his towering presence filling the room. "The board has been notified. They are voting on your immediate and permanent removal from your position and from this company. I suggest you have your office cleared out by morning. You are no longer welcome at Sterling Atelier. You are no longer welcome in my life." Beatrice stared at him, her face a mask of pure hatred. Without another word, she turned and stormed out of the room, her empire crumbling around her. Silas was left in the silent boardroom, the ugly truth of his sister's betrayal settling around him. He had protected Clara, but the victory felt hollow, tainted by the darkness he had been forced to confront. The atelier was safe, but he wondered if the innocent, talented young woman he had brought into his world could ever truly thrive in a place so full of shadows. The aftermath of Beatrice's ousting sent shockwaves through the atelier. The truth, carefully managed by Isabel, was circulated. Clara Hayes had been the victim of a vicious campaign of corporate sabotage orchestrated by a disgraced executive. Overnight, her status changed. The whispers and sneers from the other interns were replaced by a grudging, fearful respect. She was no longer the waitress. She was the woman who had survived a sterling family civil war. The ordeal had changed Clara too. The fear and self-doubt had been burned away in the crucible of Beatrice's betrayal, leaving behind a core of hardened steel. She returned to the intern program not as a timid outsider, but as a designer with a story to tell. With Beatrice gone, Silas's mentorship became more direct. He took a personal interest in her development, spending hours with her in the studio, pushing her concepts, refining her technique, and teaching her the intricate business of fashion. He wasn't just her boss, he became her champion. He saw in her a raw, untainted creativity that the industry had almost crushed, and he was determined to see it flourish. Clara thrived under his guidance. Her designs became bolder, more confident. She fused the gritty reality of her past with the aspirational elegance of the Sterling brand, creating something new and authentic. She wasn't just making beautiful clothes. She was telling stories in fabric and thread. A year and a half passed. The pinnacle of the industry calendar, New York Fashion Week, arrived. Sterling Atelier's show was the most anticipated event. The gilded ballroom of the Pierre Hotel was packed with the global fashion elite editors from every major magazine, influential bloggers, A-list celebrities, and wealthy clients. The show was a triumph. Silas's main collection was hailed as a masterpiece of modern design. But as the final model left the runway, the lights dimmed, then came up again. Silas himself stepped onto the stage, a rare public appearance that sent a murmur through the crowd. "Thank you for coming," he said. His voice amplified throughout the hall. "Tonight we have celebrated the heritage of Sterling Atelier. But fashion is not just about heritage. It is about the future. It is about new voices. It is my distinct honor to present the debut capsule collection from our newest associate designer, a woman of extraordinary talent, integrity, and resilience. I present to you Clara Hayes. A new beat of music began, and the first model walked out. The collection was titled Bowery Bloom. It was a stunning tribute to Clara's journey. There were gowns that shimmered like rain on pavement coats, with the severe protective lines of city architecture, and delicate blouses embroidered with patterns that mimicked cracks in a sidewalk through which a flower might grow. The materials were a mix of high and low luxurious silks, paired with treated denim, delicate chiffon, contrasted with tough, structured wool. It was a collection that understood both hardship and hope. The finale piece was a masterwork. It was a charcoal grey peacoat, impeccably tailored, but with a silhouette that was both powerful and gentle. And on the cuff of one sleeve, embroidered in subtle, gleaming crimson thread, was the distinctive cross-stitch pattern that had started it all. It was a tribute to her mother, to her own past, and to the single act of kindness that had changed her life. When the final model stopped, the room was silent for a beat, and then it erupted. The applause was thunderous, genuine, and overwhelming. Clara, waiting nervously in the wings, was pushed gently forward by Silas. She stepped out into the blinding lights, her heart pounding. She saw the entire audience on their feet. In the front row, she saw Silas not smiling, but giving her a slow, proud nod of profound respect. Next to him was a beaming Isabelle Laurent. And a few seats down, an invited guest of honor, was Mrs. Gable from the diner, weeping with joy. Even Mr. Henderson was there, tucked away in a back row, looking utterly flabbergasted. As Clara Hayes stood on the runway, taking her bow under the adoring lights of the fashion world, she was no longer the poor waitress from the daily grind. She was a designer in her own right, a testament to the fact that sometimes the most exquisite designs are not crafted in a studio, but forged in the fires of compassion, integrity, and an unwavering belief in the goodness of others. Her future, once a frayed and broken thread, had been rewoven into a magnificent tapestry, all because of a single coat given on a cold winter's night. The story of Clara Hayes and Silas Sterling is more than just a tale of fortune reversed. It's a powerful reminder of the unseen connections that bind us all. It proves that our true worth isn't measured by what we own, but by what we are willing to give away. Clara's simple act of compassion wasn't a transaction expecting a return. It was a pure reflection of her character. And in the end, it was her character, not just her hidden talent, that the world of luxury couldn't help but reward. Her story teaches us that integrity is the most timeless design, and kindness is the one accessory that never goes out of style. It challenges us to look closer at the strangers we meet, and to never underestimate the power of our own small gestures to change a life, or even our own. If this story moved you, please let us know by hitting the like button. Share it with someone who might need a reminder that goodness is its own reward. And for more incredible, true-life stories that uncover the extraordinary hiding in our everyday lives, make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Thank you for listening.